Okay, everybody. Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Savannah Suttle, and I'm here with Seth Rudin. We are so excited to be hosting this webinar on should I sell my business or pass it on, considerations for business owners. It is right now November 22nd, 2024. We are post-election, and we are right at the beginning of the great generational wealth transfer as we start having more than $3 billion of wealth transferring every day. And so this is a great opportunity to kind of look at, okay, what is the state of business and what is the state of business transition and succession planning and exits and all of the things that kind of come up, particularly if you haven't started talking about them with your family in time for the holidays. So I'm here with Seth Rudin, who is a very prominent business broker in Seattle. Both of us are based in Seattle. I'm very happy to have him on. Seth, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hey, thank you, Savannah, for having me. Thank you for everybody for joining. I hope if you're in Seattle area, you have power and you're staying warm. Obviously, we had the bomb cyclone. I'm Seth Rudin, as Savannah noted. I am a mergers and acquisitions broker for IBA. IBA stands for International Business Associates. We'll be celebrating our 50th anniversary next year. We've helped sell over 4,300 privately held or family-owned businesses. Some of them means advising clients who have family matters who want to either pass it on to their children or a family member, or they want to take it to the outside market. And I am pleased to join Savannah in helping you do that.
Awesome. Okay. Well, Seth, thank you so much. Would you mind just kind of giving us an overview of what exactly are you seeing in the marketplace right now in terms of demographics and trends and just generational businesses? What are you seeing that's coming up pretty regularly?
Sure. So I'll talk from a seller perspective and a buyer perspective. From a seller perspective, as everybody knows, it's not a great surprise. The generations are getting older. The people who really fuel our economy in the United States are business owners, and they are getting older, and they want to figure out how to retire. Some of the younger generations haven't grasped, that they want to own a business, and others have. And so we're seeing a mix where the generation of wealth, right? So what Savannah and I are talking about, right, is the passage of a business from the parent to their children or to a cousin. And others are not adapting through it. So we're having to coach them through it, make an assessment, and we'll talk through that in this discussion. On the buyer side, right, to be able to acquire a company, they got to have the experience, the knowledge, and the passion, and then the financing ability, right? So, some of the kids who watch their fathers and mothers work really hard realize they don't want to live that life and they choose to go pursue a different dream, or not because of their passion, but because of how much they worked, right? Just the level of effort to run a business. Usually it's not a 8 to 5, 5 day a week job owning a business. It's 7 days a week, 24 hours on, take some breaks for your family. That's often the case of an entrepreneur. And that scares, some of these kids, right? And I'm sure Savannah has talked to a lot of these folks who've seen that, and
Yeah.
that's caused it. And then lastly, the ability to have the financing, right? So if you have a high performing business, it may be that the earnout or the financing can't be purchased by the kids. So sometimes the owners have enough wealth accumulated over the years where they're just okay handing it to the children. And other times they have to sell it so that they can set up their retirement, right, and establish their financing success. And sometimes it means they don't sell it to their kids in that case.
Mhm.
But and sometimes the kids will work for the new owner too. So that's what we're seeing.
So what kind of funding options are you seeing right now? So if I'm a small business owner and I'm like, okay, look, I've got four kids and one of them has always said they wanted to take it on, but I don't necessarily know that they're actually cut out for it. And other ones that are cut out for it don't want to be involved, or they've already got careers established, or they live across the country. And, I really want to be sure that they are going to be the right fit before I ask them to pick up and move their entire families and their kids are in high school, to come home and run this business. So, what are some of those considerations that you as a small business owner are going to be thinking about in terms of bringing your family into the business, and how will you exit? Like, how will you start thinking about funding for that?
Multitude of ways I can answer that question. I'll start on the first part, the financing part, and then we'll talk together on how we would assess if they're the readiness, right, regardless of the financing, right, if they're ready. On the financing side, depending on, the first step should be the owner getting a third party assessment of what is my business worth, right? It should not be a guessing game, um, which should be done professionally with somebody with transactional knowledge. And that's where we can help. We have the transactional knowledge versus, you could pay a third party corporate valuation. All they do are valuations for property tax, life estate, divorces, and stuff like that. But what they don't have is how much will a third party actually buy the business. And that's truly what a business is worth. It's right. It's not what I say as a mergers and acquisitions or a corporate appraiser. It's actually what would Savannah pay for someone else's business. And so that's the first step, is they should get it independently done. And then, have a candid conversation with their children if they are interested. If they raise their hand and said, hey, I'm willing to move over, or I live in your city and I feel like I'm experienced. I have the wherewithal to A, fund it out of my bank account, B, to get a loan from a bank like an SBA loan, or three, the parent is happy and trusts that they can give a seller note, right, where they're the bank, right,
Mhm.
issuing a loan. And what would be terrible is if the parent gives the loan with their retirement savings and it fails, and now the parent is, in a severe financial position, one,
Mhm.
and two, the relationship now is materially injured. Money, will change people. You know, it's hard when it's bloodline, right? So there are a lot of serious considerations that has to be taken accounted for. But those
When
are
I would even say, interject that even if it's just one kid that you're working with, if there are other siblings involved, and now sibling A has jeopardized the retirement and well-being and maybe long-term care of the parents, and the other siblings are having to step in and figure it out, then that also creates a whole different dynamic.
100%, 100% agreed. And then the other part, right, is they could take a loan against their the child, right? If they had worked in the industry, or they own a house, they could, take a reverse 401k loan and pay themselves interest. There's separate programs for that. And then they could also take a mortgage, a line of credit against their house. A lot of different ways.
Mhm.
We could talk endlessly on different ways to finance, but those are the main ones. With the
Mhm.
interest rate stabilizing, post-election, uh, folks are able to acquire and feel more confident now about entering into transactions than they did, say, in September, with the
Mhm.
uncertainty of what was going to happen. Not trying to make a political statement.
Yeah.
That's just a fact of how buyer activity has been.
Yeah. With how are you seeing the market in terms of, like, are you seeing a lot of buyers right now, or are millennials and Gen X and people, who have been kind of early to mid-career during the last several financial crises, are they able to buy as many businesses, or who's buying the businesses? Is it mostly private equity?
No, if it's a profitable business and it appears that it's not just a one-time increase in their price, right, in their revenues and performance, they're going to join in, and they're going to try to buy the company, and they'll find it. So we have all sorts of listings available for sale where we're getting an assortment of buyers who are willing to participate, including private equity. They often, inquire, but they never follow through. And you find that the common person who wants to just own a business and have a generational wealth is the one finalizing the deals. We're
Mhm.
talking about transactions typically less than $50 million, 50.
Are you seeing many multi-generational businesses coming up for sale? And if so, in which generation are you seeing those?
For folks over 50 years old are the ones that are typically the most likely to go for sale. The ones
Mhm.
in their 40s that are still got, powder, they still got energy, they want to keep running. They're not ready to make a change. Sometimes people in their 40s change because, the 8-year itch is sort of true. There's a rule for a house that you typically own your house for 8 years. And there's somewhat truth for that. And for business, that people get the 8-year itch after doing something. They want to rejuvenate their energy and learn something more. And they feel like they've taken as far as they can. They've learned as much as they they want to, and now they want to challenge themselves somewhere else.
Yeah. In terms of like generations of ownership. So like, let's say that it's a couple who owns the business and they're in their mid 60s and they've owned it. They're now the grandkids of the company. Are you seeing any of those where of the company founder? Let's say it was founded in the late 1800s.
Yeah, I mean, same thing, just how they acquired it, sort of, it's nice, it's multi-generational, but it's the same sort of question, right? Whether you've got it from your father and their grandfather, or you started it and now it's still the same decision, right? What do I do with my business? Can my three kids handle it, or my one kid, or should I sell it to the public? Those are all the same questions.
So could you walk us through the typical process for selling your business, and what would a small to medium sized business owner need to know, or even just anybody who's really has not ever considered selling their business and they're like, oh, actually, I might need to start thinking about that.
Sure. I think let's first maybe talk. I mean, unless you want to go there, but I was thinking we'd first touch on the readiness for the kids and then talk about the process.
Oh, 100%. Sure. Yes. So for those of you who are looking at, should I pass this on to my kids? It is really helpful to stop and do a solid inventory of what do you think it will take, right? Take your kids out of the picture for a second and pretend that you are going to hire a non-family CEO to run your enterprise, or even just somebody who is, somebody else will come in and run your company. One, does your company stand on its own without you in the middle? And if it does not, then you need to seriously evaluate whether you actually have a company or whether you are just self-employed with some helpers. And do you have a system that you can pass on? Do you have something that you can actually have another person come in, learn the role, do the things, and you can wholesale leave it? Because if you are just trying to replicate yourself, then that's fine. But what you're doing is you're replicating, instead of a business system, you are replicating a form of self-employment. And there are plenty of people who will come in, they will buy a practice, they will buy a client list, they will buy all kinds of things and step into self-employment. That's great. There are still people who will buy that and whatever you've set up. But when you start thinking about how you're going to pull in your children, think about who you would want to be in the role that you currently have, and so there's your company as it existingly stands. Then there's your company as you anticipate it will grow. What does your company need now, and what does it need later? How much are you willing to stick around in order to see that transition occur? Is there a big growth curve? Are you just trying to maintain? Are your kids high achievers? Are they rock stars where they just really like to keep things steady and, equilibrium and homeostasis? Understanding who your kids are and how they're wired is great. And yet also, you really have to understand how your business, is their way that they are wired, what is appropriate for what your business needs now and later.
I also think that kids can grow and learn, and having a candid conversation with them before you've evaluated the value of your business and you've done the assessment that Savannah just walked through, but also just sitting down and saying, hey, what are your interests? What do you want to achieve?
Mm-hmm.
And figuring out that matrix to see, is this something that they would consider? Maybe you do this a year or two in advance, just saying, hey, I'm contemplating my retirement in a couple of years. Where would you be is this something you want to be interested in? I should put you in my plan or not? And don't, and make sure they set the expectation that they won't be hurt if you choose to go to the outside or stay within the family, because you may choose, selling to your family member can have negative implications. And unfortunately, I've seen a situation where a business was passed to the child and it had to come back to the owner, and it damaged the relationship between father and daughter, and that's the last thing we really want to see happen, right?
Yeah, for sure. For sure. And I would say that if your kids are in a state where you want them to take over, they want to take over, make sure that they've worked in the business for a few years. I know you mentioned about 2 years. if you can afford to do 5, do that. Do longer. Have them come in, and especially depending on how the size of the business, right? And how, your kid will likely be different than you. And also, the system of how you operate together will be different as long as you are in it. So just as a function of, if you're there making the executive decisions, then your kid's not going to have that opportunity to be the one person that everything is relying on to make the executive decision until you step out. Once you start leaving or start steadily exiting, that's when you're going to see your kids step into more of the roles and responsibilities that you might have expected from them in the beginning.
Yeah, you want to make sure that they've seen all facets of the business. If it's not, some businesses are one dimensional. They're making one simple product and selling it, or we got a bakery, but there's the back office and there's the front office and dealing with customers or suppliers, that they've touched all of it, and you feel that they can be successful. They can handle the stress of multiple channels coming at them at the same time, right? These things happen. I've seen kids have, where they were working in the business. I have a current listing, where the son couldn't handle the pressure of being in the front line. So they found a role that the son can prosper on, but it's definitely not in the driver's seat. And that's okay, right? There's nothing wrong. The son's a good person, good job. He makes good pay. Just that's not, he doesn't like being the pitcher on the baseball team. He'd rather be the center, the left fielder.
What about if, Seth, if the business isn't profitable? So, for example, I see sometimes families will come and they'll say, okay, we've got this business. It hasn't been doing well. My kids have wanted it, but I don't really want to hand them a hot mess. Is that fair? They think they can turn it around. What consideration should be taken into in those instances?
There are a lot of considerations. First, what type of business? Do they have anything strategic, like intellectual property? Think patent, think something that it's hard to break into, that maybe the owner is older and didn't understand how to keep up with the sales and marketing efforts that's required to keep, the company going and fueled, and the sales just drop. But if somebody came in who had the, you know, energy and the ability to raise capital, if that's what was needed for working capital to get the marketing out, they could turn it around. And if that's a legitimate, business case, and then, is their child able and willing to do that? If it's a business that has mechanical problems, or AI is going to replace it soon, now we have a different consideration, right? One, I'm going to have a hard time just getting a third party buyer, right, to buy it, let alone a family member. And so that one might be where you want to sunset the business and have them pursue a different dream. You don't want to hand over like you said, a hot mess to someone, especially a loved one, let alone any other person personally. But we just have to be honest with ourselves. It's hard because that's your baby. You've been working on it for perhaps multi-decades, and you don't want to give it up. But to be honest sometimes with yourself about what you're wanting, is important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I would also add, there's a component of legacy and identity in either sunsetting something or even just saying like, hey, I know that this has been part of, I saw this recently, a company that they were looking at passing on to the third generation, but it had hit some pretty significant infrastructure issues. It was an infrastructure company, and a lot of their assets were becoming liabilities due to just degradation over time. And so the third generation was looking at substantial investment in order to get them into the black, as well as to overhaul all of this existing infrastructure. And it was going to be a multi-year process with not a lot of guarantees given the recent legislation. And so that family required a significant sit down of saying like, hey, we don't want to burden you with this risk. And so we think we might actually be able to have a smaller sale and exit. And then, we'd love to do something together with you and do a new venture, a new startup, a new whatever that would be more fun, less risky, and something that you can really cut your teeth in. So, yeah.
Very good. I totally agree with that.
Yeah. Awesome. So, what's a typical process look like? So if I'm a business owner and I'm trying to consider selling, and just what are the variables? Most of the people I see really want to understand the landscape before they make a decision one way or the other. So help us understand what the process of, if you're just starting to scratch the surface on considering selling, where should you start?
Great. I'm going to do that. And then I want you to touch on the emotional process, the journey
Okay.
that, and I've gone through that as myself, and it can be quite crazy.
Sure.
Um, So the first part, once you've decided or thinking about the sale, and the best time to bring me in is not, hey, I need to sell next month. And sometimes that happens. You get cancer, you get a divorce, hopefully none of that happens. But those things do drive an immediate sale, or you just ran out of gas. But the best sale is a plant sale. So what I mean by that is you came to me, a couple years in advance, and we do an assessment of your business. We do evaluation, just like a buyer would. We're going to ask all the tough questions. We're going to tour your business and do all those things. And we're going to run it through our models and come up with a range of value. And we're going to sit down and we're going to walk through what that is, how we came up with it, and what are the levers that you can press today to make it more valuable over a certain timeline. And based on your goals for selling your business, we'll then fit into those timelines. And then hopefully each year we'll do a true up and saying, okay, did you make progress or not? And then eventually it's go time where we're going to then market it and put it for sale. So we sign an agreement to work together. Because we came up with a value and a price, and then we then do the marketing and to curate buyers, right? Whether it comes from IBA's strategic database of buyers, or we call on buyers that we've identified through the process, or we bring it to the public marketplace. Our goal is to get as many viable buyers as possible. Not every company will get a bidding war, and some will. So wherever that fits, we will work with the buyers on a confidential basis. They'll have to sign an NDA, and they got to prove that they have the financial whereabouts to finance and secure the deal, right? We don't want to get to signing and they can't come through with the money, right? We have to convince a landlord, perhaps, or they have to buy the property. So the landlord has to approve you. The
Mhm.
lawyers, the bankers, and the attorneys, CFOs potentially all have to approve. And so we've come to an agreement. The seller obviously has the full right to, counter offer, accept it, or reject an offer. And once we've accepted an offer, we work through the process all the way through by working on the definitive legal documents, often called a purchase sale agreement or a stock purchase sale, depending on the type. They get the bank financing. We work with the landlords. If it's a franchise, we're working with getting that assigned and all those different things that we have to navigate. It's very complicated. Usually takes anywhere from 6 to 9 months. Sometimes there's complicated businesses that require state approval, and that might take a couple extra months. But we work through all that process and get them paid at escrow, where they get their money. Then they have to fulfill a transition period, right? You can't just sell business and run away. You got to teach Savannah how to run this new cool company that Savannah just bought, and the seller is going to sit side by side and gradually teach her where she's in full speed driving this Ferrari down the street, and that now she knows how to control and be prosperous.
Yeah, and with that alongside, what are some of the common emotional things that you see? And I can speak to that as well, but I'd love to hear from you first. What are some of the recent scenarios you've seen?
Sure. So first, I always tell my clients, get a hobby, something that requires you to be engaged so that you're not thinking about it. So running and walking to me, and I'm not a runner, but that to me is not a good enough hobby because it can still think about the current negotiation. I play pool. It's a billiards, 9 ball, 8 ball. And so that, if I'm thinking about, the negotiations of my sale of my last company when I was playing it, I would definitely not do well in the game. So I like hobbies that distract and free up the mind, because you are making a decision about the largest purchase, and it can be taken personal when it's not meant to be. You're going through legal negotiations and you see all these red lines from the attorneys. And I had a client where I sold a greenhouse and a farm, and I swear the buyer's attorney was paid by the word maybe. And constant red lines. It frustrated, I think, also the buyer, but it really frustrated my seller.
Mm,
But it's hard not to take those things personal.
yeah.
And you got to be able to let it roll and just know it's once we get past that, it's going to be fine. It's not the buyer. The buyer is listening to an attorney who's making a risk assessment. Their job is to minimize risk and get paid as much as they can. right?
Mhm.
I mean, they're
Mhm.
good people, they can make deals happen.
Mhm.
But that's the journey that we have to figure out. And that's one example, right? Banking, insurance, landlords, all those things can cause for constraints.
Mhm.
How
Mhm.
about yourself? What have you seen?
Yeah. So what I would say is several things. I have several different thoughts and I sequence them.
Mhm.
One of the things that's come up a lot recently is just is early onset dementia or Alzheimer's. So sometimes when a business owner is, or just cognitive decline in general. So sometimes when a business owner is starting to experience cognitive decline, particularly if they are the founder and their family is starting to see it and they know that something's got to change. But let's say that that person's not ready to give up the reins. They're not ready to pass the torch to the next generation or to consider selling, right? Or they would love to just be the captain and go down with the ship, and just whatever. The business of death and dying, unfortunately, the administrative uh, uh, burden is substantial and significant, not just for the people who are doing the living and the dying, but for the people under them who are having to deal with the estate. So one of the things that I try to encourage people about is like, look, we don't know how many days we have right in our lives. Give me 1 second. We do not have a clear picture on how we're going to go. So as much as you can create an exit strategy while you have capacity to do so, do it.
If I
Not
can
just
add to
for
that
you.
too.
Hmm?
If I can add to that, I don't want to
Yeah.
interrupt your thought. In those situations, it's really important to find another party in the family that, if it really is serious dementia, it's problematic to sell a company, legal company, and they forget that they agreed to something, right? And now you've
Yes.
sold a big asset and they're like, what happened? And now you're talking to attorneys, right? Nobody wants that. So
Right.
it's important that, you reach deep into the family, that, there's a power of attorney, established. Ideally, everybody should have this in their
Yes.
personal assets, right? Healthcare attorney, power of attorney, a legal power of attorney, and a finance power of attorney. I'm sure you've consulted on that, and
Mhm.
for my job, I have to make sure that those things are in place. If I can assess a situation like you just described, I would be hesitant to sell a company if I felt like they weren't mentally fit
Mhm.
to approve it, and I would definitely be working through that scenario.
Yeah, absolutely. And not just mentally fit to approve it, but to continue with that transition and succession process. Right. And so sometimes in those situations, I would actually say that the family, if you can come alongside somebody and walk with them and understand how they've shaped the business and shadow them, apprentice under them, right, you're going to have a better idea of their cognitive decline as well as of how they're running the business and where the gaps are. Right. So it's going to be scary, but it's going to be probably more steady than trying to pass it off to a new buyer, um, in which you can also do later on if you don't want to do that full time, right? You can get it to a place where you know that you can pass it off successfully and not essentially transition a lemon of a business. Um, One of the things too that I see is a lot of people not wanting to give up the reins to their kids or just in general, like you said, getting a hobby. So often entrepreneurs have they have dedicated so much time and energy that they have lost access to all of these other different parts of themselves. And so I see this particularly, I love working with men in their 70s who are in the founding cohort
Mhm.
because this fits them, right? And they're just like, I
Mhm.
mean, this is my baby, and I have built and done all these things. And the reason that they are so invested in this is they have been able to manifest all of these different components of who they are, right? In all of these different ways. And they have been able to see that success over time in a way that's very unique, right? And I think we've lost a lot of that ability to look back and see accomplishment um, over the last several generations, with technology. Let me put it this way. It used to be when you were planting and growing something or building something, you got to the end of a row and you could look back and see what you've done. Right. These days you close all your tabs and you're like, what did I do? It's
Exactly.
just like object permanence is just out the window. So now of course that's not true for everybody, but with business specifically, there is the ability to move and shape in ways that are very unique. So what I try to encourage people to do is look, nobody wants to put you out to pasture. You're afraid that you will be dead in 6 months, and you might be if you are so bored, and who would want to live after that? Like, no. So that's not the goal. The goal is to be responsible. The goal is to transition from you being the leader to you being the steward, from you being the one who's calling all the shots to you helping coach and train the next generations or the next leaders on how to call the shots, how to do the critical thinking. You're going from general to coach, right? And so that's where I want people to have this paradigm shift that your legacy or your identity, right, can continue with your level, with your quality of life. It just needs some adjustment. And this is not a time, this is a time to kind of pass certain things off so you can start new things, right? You as an entrepreneur have so much more to give both your future and the future generations, right, who are coming behind you. And so to be able to instill all of that knowledge, to be able to instill those skills, that work ethic, that understanding, the context, of even just explaining like, hey, 40 years ago when we built this facility, we didn't have any idea about fire code, and so we had to retrofit it 20 years later. And we had this guy named Jim, and he was the one who did it. Well, yeah, 5 years after that, Jim went to jail and we had to find, so then we had to redo it again. And then, so even just being able to help people understand, like when they come back and they're opening up things and they're like, I'm sorry, why is this the way it is? Now they'll know, right? Set future them up for success, set future you up for success, and start becoming that repository of knowledge, not just about your own endeavor and enterprise, but about how you became the person you did in this journey.
So a couple examples, it's not uncommon to have the founder just become an employee. So I sold a sporting goods store and he works 10 hours a week, because he's got so much energy bundled up, he couldn't sit at home and he wanted to be able to get some therapy, not staying at home with his wife and maybe his wife was kicking him out too. Another one is 82. We sold his business at 82. He still had energy, but nobody was going to hire him. So he built a charity up for kids. He's passionate about soccer and he did that. And so it's like you said, it's showing them a path that they will be relevant and important so that they don't feel like they're going to lose their, because some of it becomes their whole persona, right? Like you mentioned, very well spoken.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, recently I was working with a family where the father had founded the business and it was a very reactionary business, right? If you think it's kind of a repair company of sorts. And when people call, they are in a deep sense of urgency and they need this thing fixed. And he absolutely loved to be the hero, right? The problem is that everything in the business became contingent upon his critical thinking, his ability to call the shots, his ability to understand what exactly repair needed to have happen. And then he would delegate to everybody else. When Gen 2 came along, they were like, one, I don't want to be on call like my dad has been, just like you were saying earlier. I want quality of life. I need to be able to train employees more effectively because we've had employees who've been here for 20 plus years, and that's awesome. So they know the drill, but they're all about to retire. And these younger generations don't want to stick around for that long. So I'm going to have to anticipate turnover, right? So younger generations started trying to figure out, okay, then part of the reason they pulled me in was to say, okay, this has been very centered on dad. How do we actually take it out of this organic relationship model, keep the relationship, keep the culture, but move it to a more systematized, structured, standardized thing that can grow and scale and can keep going without burning us out, right? And so I see that a lot with the friction. But what was interesting is that as much as dad agreed with that direction, dad had a really uncomfortable time becoming less reactionary because that's how he's built. So as the kids started to create and streamline more processes and they would give everyone back more time, we had to intentionally with dad say, okay, dad, how are you going to fill your time? Because otherwise you're going to just start adding stuff, adding more chaos and crisis back to the plates because that's what you love. And that's okay. We're not here to change you. What can you do instead? And that's when he picked up also some volunteer work for some disaster response stuff that just really scratched that itch. but it didn't interfere with a family business. So if you can get strategic about thinking about how people are made up, their genetic makeup, right? And saying, okay, how are you wired? We're not going to change that, but how do we create a separate context for you to thrive in so that this one can continue to grow and change the way it needs to? Kind of divorce yourself from, or not really divorce, but yeah, take yourself away from the architecture, build yourself a different trellis so your vines can go.
100% agree. Very well said. How what have we seen once you've seen the kids take over? What are some of the things that you've seen on the families that you're consulting, how they were able to adapt and manage the emotions that they have?
Yeah. So, a lot of it's the sandwich generation that's coming online. And so, um, when families can do it well, they give their kids enough time to plan, in terms of where they're going to be living. Are they going to have time, energy to have kids? Right. That's a big one I see, particularly among women in their 30s, where they're like, okay, I'm at the stage where I either need to have kids or not. But if I'm going to be taking over the family business, I might not have that time. So am I okay with just being auntie? You know, uh, and done well, there is this sandwich generation, is able to have a clear goal and roadmap and able to have clear expectations with their families and with themselves and really start planning for the future long term. What often happens is right now we're in this stage where, you know, eh, we have so much information coming at us all the time. We're constantly having to filter, sort, organize, etc. Um, and plan. How many times have you been like, oh, I want to do dinner with this person? It's like, if I don't put it in my calendar, it will not happen. So in the same way, this younger generation is very much of that mindset of, okay, hey, I need to roadmap, I need to plan, I need to create structure. Older generations, not always the case. Sometimes, but not always. And so what I see frequently is when the younger generation comes and takes over, they are looking at creating very structured timelines and roadmaps that in some ways feel uncomfortable to older generations, because older generations, they also know, like, yeah, you can have a draft plan, but it's not going to work. Like, life happens. And so you got to be able to be agile and all this kind of stuff. So there tends to be a difference in expectation between how much structure is helpful versus inhibitive. And so inhibitive. So anyway, yeah.
Excellent, very good. It's great they're building this ecosystem, right, for families to take over their generations, and then we're helping them be successful in assessing them and with those criterion, right? Can you talk about, I know I've talked about it from a business broker perspective, right? From your side, when you're talking pre-planning, how emotional is that journey? What are some of any examples you want to share of ones that worked really well and others that maybe didn't?
Yes. So sometimes people come to me because they're like, look, we would love to pass the business on to our kids, but our kids don't get along. And so we don't know what to do because, if we pass it on to one but not the other, it's going to cause all of these issues. So is there any way that you can facilitate and get us on the same page? Sometimes that's a yes, sometimes it's a no. There's one thing I will say is, people sometimes, it's kind of like when you get married and you think that having a baby will fix it.
Mhm.
In the same way, if you sometimes think that, okay, if I can just dangle my will out here or the business or whatever, and that'll make my kids get along, it won't. It won't. And the thing is that with people getting along, they have to want to get along with each other, and they have to be willing to work on working together, even if that's just figuring out how do we survive each other over Christmas, you know. Uh, and so DNA roulette is real, and when you never know what kind of kid you're going to get. And sometimes, sibling one will just be the polar opposite of sibling two, and they're just oil and water and they just don't get along. And that's okay. But in order for them to actually be civil, they may not even ever be close, but in order for them to be civil, they have to figure out a literal operating model of how do they relate, right? And you can't do that work for them. And so what ends up happening, one of the things that I do like about business is that business will clarify and provide structure around those operating models and hierarchies and power dynamics and proximity and all the things that are usually very intuitive in family systems. Well, in business, you have to actually map out a process workflow. So, okay, once this sales order is complete, it's going to be delivered to the project manager who is going to do this type of checklist. So it provides a level of structure that you might not otherwise articulate. And these are the expectations. If you are organic and you are and intuitive and you're not very process driven, then sometimes it can become more complicated and create more friction. So a lot of times where I help families is when you're coming in and you're experiencing friction, it's usually an underdevelopment of structure and a lack of clarity around expectations. And so then people start fighting over assumptions of like, well, I think you just wanted this from me, or I think you're, whatever. And sometimes that's true, right? But kind of unstitching, okay, here's what was said, here's what they intended, here's what they wanted, and now here's how it came across. Here's how it triggered your stuff, which then created this reaction, which then created this response. And so now we can actually map out the process of what happened. Let's scratch all that for just a second. What needs to happen? What do you want out of this relationship? What do you want out of when you submit a sales order? Right? What do you want when you receive a sales order? Like, what do you want in terms of your relationship? You want respect. You want to be heard. You want to be understood. When you say, hey, when you kick it back and say, hey, this isn't working, you want to be interpreted as being what? Pragmatic, right? As opposed to just being passive aggressive. This person sees you as being passive aggressive, right? So we understand that. We can understand where that comes from. We're going to solve the intention part, but we're also going to solve the structure part. And we're going to work on each other giving each other the benefit of the doubt, right? Now, there are some people who are really good at giving the benefit of the doubt, and they're really good at picking up from these kind of fractious relationships and saying, okay, we're going to change how we work together, and I'm going to try hard and you're going to try hard, and we're both going to understand that we're going to give 100%, 150%. And mistakes are going to happen. And when mistakes happen, I'm going to consciously choose to not attribute it to these old narratives and these old paradigms and, well, you're just lazy or you're just this, that, and the other, and it's hard. You have to rewire your brains, right? Most people are not willing to put in that kind of work. But it is absolutely necessary. And so one of the things that I would say is like, when families come and they're trying to use the business as a way to force harmony, just be aware that in order to do that, the core issue is that people have to want to be harmonious. There's an old joke. It's like, how many therapists does it take to change a light bulb? Only one. But does the light bulb want to change? And it's funny, but it's true too with families. They've got to want to work together. If you want to work together, where there's a will, there's a way. Now, one thing too, what I'll say is like, if the family comes in and they're, let's say that they all get along, but they need to have a big transition. Let's say that parents are retiring and they're passing it on to the next gen. And let's say that the next gen let's say they're in middle management and they're not really quite prepared to be in C-suite and they need some growth. And not only do they need it, but other employees in the organization also need context and structure. There's a let's say that you've got, I don't know, that by the time that they take over, you're going to go away from a husband-wife duo to now you've got, one kid who's in the driver's seat and the other kids are not in the business. This is functionally a change in organizational structure. And it will then therefore change the dynamics of how the organization functions. Just like in football, if you change the positions of the players on the field, you will change the dynamics of how the football play unfolds, right? And so in the same way, if you are taking somebody from, I don't know, a running back position and you're putting them in quarterback position, they need to have a different choreography of how they work with the other teammates. That takes practice. And sometimes there's this expectation that, oh, I'm just going to pass the business on to my kids and they'll figure it out and whatever. Sometimes it's not just about your kids. It's actually about the rest of your team and them understanding, what does this mean now? How does authority work now? What are the rules and expectations, roles and responsibilities now? And maybe those are staggered. So maybe, for example, in this year, now you've got profit and loss responsibilities for this one division, right? And then next year, you're going to have, assuming that you do well, next year, I'm going to make sure that you're also involved in these larger decision skills. And now I'm also going to set you up for strategic planning for these things. And I want to make sure that like these are going to be your zones of genius and your zones of responsibility. And at each of these milestones, we are going to communicate to other people what this will mean for them, how they are supposed to report to you, what their expectations need to be for their own departments, for their own team members, so that you can start to see a steady shift in responsibility and accountability, as opposed to just this kind of nepotistic dump of like, oh yeah, well, yeah, you got it. And so, sometimes that works, especially if you're smaller. You don't necessarily need all of the formality. But the larger you are, then the more communication, um, the more employees that you have, the more risk there is for miscommunication and gossip. And if you don't get ahead of that by creating a structured plan and by creating clarity, because everybody just wants to know, like, what's their future look like, right? So they have anxiety about this. Prevent that anxiety, because it will erode your company culture faster than you would ever believe. So create a roadmap for what is the succession going to look like. Help your kid have clarity, help yourself have clarity, and then help your staff have clarity.
Very well said, Savannah. On fire today. I love it. Look at that energy. I think now we got a question, and if we have 10 minutes left, if others want to submit questions, we're happy to take them. We have a question from a gentleman named Sergey. He's one of my colleagues. He said you'd help with exit planning, let's say 1 to 2 years. You look at the valuation. What do you look for in terms of long-term planning? You're looking at value drivers, the accounting, financial metrics, etc. So I certainly want to help, clients, plan for an exit. We're going to look at it, financials. We're going to look at customer concentration. Savannah touched on founder's dilemma, where, are you self-employed if everything revolves around you, if you take yourself out of the business, or do you have the ability to delegate and you have a general manager who can easily step up when a new buyer comes in? All those things and others will be looked at. Is the equipment, does the place need cleaning up? Are the financials tidy? Do they P&Ls relatively close to the tax returns? Are they having the last 12 months have a bunch of negative growth and there's an obvious issue in the sales team? Are they spending enough in marketing? Do they actually have a sales team, or are they just resting on their laurels and glad that they got shut, the consult, brand equity, people just keep buying repeat, but they're not hunting and growing. So that's what we will do. And then hopefully we've earned the respect of our client and they want to continue to work with us throughout. And obviously the economics of that deal, we work out and how that goes. We have a second question, and this one's for Savannah. Do you recommend any books or resources for family members that are struggling to communicate? Thanks for this, from Garrett McCovern.
Oh, hey, Garrett. Yes, for ones that are struggling to communicate, there's a great book called, oh my goodness, it's right over on my table. Actually, let me go grab it. 1 second.
Sure. Great questions. Thank you guys for attending. Hopefully you found all this. We're going to answer your question, obviously, but in the meantime, hopefully you found this session to be helpful and useful. Thanksgiving's coming up.
All right, so this is an old book. I actually have it from grad school, from when I was a therapist. This is called Talking and Listening Together by Sherrod and Phyllis Miller. It's actually a couples communication book. But in this, it gives some really amazing exercises for how to start attuning to each other and hearing the actual core of what you need to hear. And so if it's just communication of like, hey, we just can't seem to quite get it, this is a great place to start. If you're looking at exit planning, there are several resources out there that I will post when I post this webinar. But if you look at the Certified Exit Planning Association, SEPA, they have a number of exit planning materials that you can start working through with your family. And I also have a family business pop quiz And it is for your family members. I developed this, and it is for parents if you want to give it to your kids or whoever you think would be your emergency contact if something were to happen, you were to become incapacitated. And it's just like a questionnaire of like, hey, do you know who our accountant is? Do you know the EIN? Do you know if the business name is a DBA or our legal name? What are the legal addresses? Do we own or lease our properties? All kinds of other things. And it's just kind of a fun thing to discuss with each other and say like, hey, are you actually prepared to take on the business in the event of a crisis? Hopefully it'll be a wake up call for people. And yeah, it'll also be kind of fun.
Very good. That's a great book. If there's no other, these were great questions. I think we had a very thorough, efficient hour. Savannah, I'm so honored to have partnered here and, these other deals. We have a transaction in Oregon we're working on, and I look forward to seeing that to completion amongst others in the future.
Same, Seth. It's awesome. Thank you so much. It's such a joy to work with you. And thank you for doing this with me. And thank you everybody for attending. So lovely to see you.
Awesome. Thank you. Thanks, Sergey. Thanks, Garrett. Everybody else.
Bye.
Bye.